Hello and welcome to this module for Jira administrators. In this module, we'll cover a lot of advanced features that Jira administrators need to know and understand. Things like permissions, building and editing workflows, understanding workflows, creating new issue types, screens, their schemes, and so much more. Now, before we start, I do want to point out that just about everything in this module requires administrative permissions. So if you're not a Jira administrator, you probably won't be able to follow along. But if you are a Jira administrator, or even if you're not a Jira administrator and you just want to get a better understanding of how Jira works under the hood, this module is packed with the fundamental things you need to know how the inner workings of Jira function. So let's dive in with our next video. In this video, we'll look at how we can add users to Jira. All right, so in order to add users into Jira, you need to go into the administrative backend, and that's going to be true for pretty much everything we're doing in this module. If you don't have Jira administrative rights, you probably won't be able to do much of what we're going to do in this module. So in order to do that, we'll cover up this gear up here in the top right, and we're going to get familiar with the options that are under this gear, trust me, throughout this module. So come up here and then go into user management. Now in user management, it's going to jump us right away to users on the top left-hand side, which is going to allow us to create users. Now the first three, and this is something that's relatively new here in this particular screen, is the ability to add in the first three users very quickly. So I'm just going to create a few here. There's one user. There we go. Let's do, there we go. These are just fake names that I'm using just to kind of show this example here. All right, and one more. There we go. All right, so essentially what I've done is I've created these users, and then this is just a little tip, but I've actually just add plus, and then you can really add whatever you want in order to use the same email address. So that way I don't have to create a ton of different email addresses just to kind of show this. They're all going to go to the same email, or actually to its own email, but it's all under the same account. So it's all going to go to this, whatever the root is, so danlefebvre@hotmail.com. You can have whatever you want under there if you add a plus. So that's a feature of really any email address. And this is my Hotmail account. So as soon as I add this, as soon as I hit create users here, we should see on this side, this will pop up with 3 emails. So you can see that there. So one for each user, and you can see it's gone to the plus here for each user. Now, in this particular case, just to kind of show this, I want to show the process of creating an account. So this is what the end user will see when you send out an email invitation for them. So it is valid for 7 days. So after that, you'll have to resend that. If they do need you to resend that, all you need to do is just come in here and then click on resend, and that will resend the invitation to them. So you'll see that email once again. It's good for another 7 days after that. All they need to do on their end as an end user is come in here, click set my password, and then that will add, basically they just need to add their password. So I'm just going to pull a randomly generated password here. Nope, don't need to save that in LastPass. All right, so the username for this is what was in the email. So this is the username. And then the password is whatever they set. So once I log in, I will be given the default permissions inside of Jira. So if you have custom permissions set up, I'm not going to set any of this stuff up for this particular user. You're just going to be given whatever the default permissions are. So you can see right away, I can see all the demo projects, all this kind of stuff. I'm giving a default system dashboard. Now, as the administrator, you can come in and customize this, and we will look at that later on. But this is what it looks like when you create a new user. And I just kind of wanted to show that process because you're not always going to be able to see what it looks like on their end. All right, so once we've actually created those first 3 users, you'll notice that that little box up there is no longer there. Now we need to either bulk create, which will allow us to type in a bunch of different email addresses and then actually send them to them. So this is comma delimited. So if you wanted to have multiples, you could do, like this. And then essentially when you hit a comma, it's going to enter in that email. So you can do that. You can give them access right away. So if you do have multiple subscriptions with Atlassian, so things like Confluence or Bamboo or things that you're paying multiple subscription licenses to, maybe you want somebody to have access to Jira, but not necessarily to Bamboo. So in my experience, we've had that happen quite a bit where maybe this person is going to be on a marketing team or a graphics team, and they don't really need to have access to the dev toolkit that Bamboo is. Then you could just uncheck whatever the application is you don't want them to have access to. And then you can tell it how long you want before this expires. All right, so fairly straightforward as far as that is concerned for bulk users. And then if you want to create a user, you can just do this right away. Now, if you notice, this is the only way that you can actually customize the username. So if your company uses a different type of username, this would be probably the best way to create users. And what this is going to do is it's going to have, email, whatever the username is you want, the full name, and then this will send them an email to create their password, just like it did before. Or you can uncheck that to create the password for them on the back end. And then you would have to tell them whatever that password is, because it will not email them if you choose this option. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind. And we can see this if I type this in. So let's create another one here. So you can see right away what it's doing is it's assuming the username is going to be whatever is in the beginning of the email. We can change this if we want. If we wanted to change our username, that's perfectly fine. There we go. And let's say, no, we didn't want to send an invitation email. I'm just going to type in my password and then create that user. Now, when we do that, you'll notice it doesn't say anything about an invitation sent. Nothing has been sent to this user. So if I refresh my email, I haven't gotten any emails. That's because we told it to create the password, which also means it's not going to send any notification to this user. All right, so that's how we can create and add users into Jira. Let's move on to our next video. We'll take a look at how we can start to organize these users into groups. In this video, we'll look at how we can organize users in groups. All right, so in order to organize our users, we'll want to come up to the top right-hand side and come into User Management. Now, in here, by default, we'll be taken to Users where we can add new users. Let's hop down into Groups. And here we can come in and start to organize all of our Jira users. Now, how you organize this is completely up to you. In my experience, I found it was most beneficial to start by organizing it based on teams. So who's on what team? And then from there, you can even start to dial it down. There were times where I'd have to add in a user group for people with special permissions inside of Jira that I could apply to. So the primary things that you're going to be using groups for are user permissions, what things people can see. So like if people want to share a filter to a saved filter to a specific group, they can do that. So if you're not really sure how you want to organize this, I would recommend setting it up by teams first. And then after that, just kind of do it on an as needed basis. All right, because you don't want to just add a bunch of groups in here and then have to change things on your users later on. It's easier to add them as they're needed. So I'm going to create a new group. Let's call this marketing. That's our marketing team. There's nobody in here. And now we can add members. So let's say Jimmy's a part of marketing, and let's say George is a part of marketing. So we can add those users into this group. And now anytime somebody saves a filter for or shares a filter for this group, shares a dashboard with this group, anytime somebody invites somebody or shares whatever to this group, then these are the users that are going to get notified. All right, so fairly straightforward process, and there's a lot of different areas that inside of Jira that use groups in order to primarily for sharing and things like that. But on the back end, for your purposes, this will also be for permissions, that you can base permissions based on these groups as well. So we can come in and create new groups if we want to. So actually, it would maybe be something like engineering would be a little more straightforward. You can add users to them. So say maybe Jimmy's also on this team. He's kind of a half and half part-time, right? And so we can add these users in. Something else that you can do too, if you click on a user, then you can see what groups they're a part of. So you can see which groups they're a part of. You can add users to a group. So you can see Jimmy is currently a member of engineering and marketing. So we can add them to a group if we wanted to. We can say he's also part of administrators, which this will add them to give them administrative access on the back end. So be careful who you want to add to that. I just kind of want to point that out, that you can add people into that group. I'm going to remove from that group, remove from this group. That's how you can remove people from a group. Now, you do notice that there are a few groups that are created by default inside of Jira. So the description is over here, and it's fairly straightforward. This is going to give administrative access to all of Jira. So it'll give them access to this site administration as well. You can see the description here. If I make this a little bit larger, there we go. All right, so it takes quite a bit in order to be able to read all of this, which is a shame. But here's kind of what they're saying. So this top one here grants us access to all of the applications and their administration features. So not necessarily site administration. So I was backward on that. But the administrators, so that's going to give them access to administrate all of the projects, all of everything inside of Jira Software. And then if you have Confluence, it would also allow them to administrate everything inside of Confluence. But it won't allow them to add or remove those features as a site administrator. So this is site administration, where you can come in and adjust things like the billing or the applications that you have, all of that kind of stuff. In order to access this, you need to add them into the site admins group. All right, so that's essentially how we can create groups, how we can add users to groups, and then how we can actually go in and remove those groups. If we wanted to delete a group, we can just click on the X over here. It will delete. All the users in the group will not be affected. However, they will be removed. And if you have anything shared with that group, anything relying on that group, that will go away as well. So if you have a filter that's shared with a group and that group no longer exists, it won't be shared anymore. So that's something to keep in mind if you actually delete groups. All right, so that's primarily what you'll be doing here in the site administration. Other things include things like your license usage. So depending on what your license currently is, you could come in and revoke certain users' permission from the Jira software. So I could revoke this particular user. You can see now I only have 5 licenses used. That does not delete the user. Instead, what it does is it just doesn't allow them to access whatever that application is. In this case, Jira Software. If you had Confluence, which is their documentation, that would be another tab. All of these different applications are different tabs, and you can purchase licenses for different amounts of users. You can manage all of that here. You can also adjust things like if you have a password policy. This is fairly straightforward stuff for administrations. sign up options. So if you want people to be able to sign up by themselves just by going to whatever your Atlassian domain name is, if you're on the cloud, you can do that. Also things like billing, so what credit card you're using to pay for it. You can add or remove applications. So if we wanted to add in another application, we could do that. So here's a bunch of different applications that you can purchase that you can help and really integrate into Jira. So if you want to make Jira your support desk, right? So for customer service. In this video, we'll look at creating a new project. All right, so the process for creating a project is fairly straightforward. Let's come up to Projects, Create Project, and we'll be given some options for project templates that we can create. Now, these weren't always here, and so I would assume that the actual templates that you can do will also be added on by Jira, or by Atlassian rather. So, for example, when I first started using Jira, none of these templates were here. And then they started adding in software development templates, and then they started adding in business templates. So I would assume that this would also continue. So you may see more depending on when you're watching this video. I just want to point that out. But essentially what this is this will choose things like issue types and workflow for your project by default. So, for example, a Scrum project will also create a Scrum board for you. And if you click next, you'll see, okay, here's the workflow. So it's very simple to do, in progress, and then done. And these are the issue types that will be associated with this project. All right, so if I were to choose a different one, so maybe process management, you can see here's the issue types. So this is very simple this time, task and subtask. But now we have a little more complex workflow. It goes from open to in progress, and you can either cancel it, you can put it under review, in which case it would either be approved or rejected, and then done. All right, so these are all different things. So you can see, once again, slightly different for Kanban. The software development is also a little bit different there. It has a review step. And of course, we can customize this quite a bit. Have our project management as well as our task management. Very, very simple. All right, so I'm going to go with this one here, task management, because it is very simple. And we can look at kind of building onto this as we go, as we start to look at customization and all these different options that we have. So I'm going to select this. Let's give this a name since it is task management. Let's do something along the lines of, let's just call it task. There we go. So the ID key, we can call that something different if we want. I'm just going to leave it the same. Hit submit, and then our project will be created. All right, so by default, we'll be sent to our issues page, right? So we can choose the summary. We can see our issues. This is the project summary area. So same as if we come into project and we click on it here. And that is how we can create a project. Now, we've already looked at a lot of these things in previous videos for a lot of this stuff, but we haven't really looked at the administrative side and the settings. So let's move on to our next video where we'll take a look at that. In this video, we'll get an overview of the project administration screen. All right, so let's hop into our project. So I'm going to go project, task. So this is the project that we created in our previous video. And then down here at the bottom left-hand side, we have our project settings. Now, if you don't see this, your sidebar may be collapsed, in which case it would just be this little icon right here. Just click on that, and that will take you to the project administration side. So if you don't see this even here, then that means you do not have permissions to administer that project, in which case you would need to reach out to your Jira administrator and have them give you permissions to do that. All right, so we'll be going over a lot of these things in our subsequent videos, but I want to take a couple minutes just to kind of get familiar with this screen in particular. All right, so we have our summary, which just essentially gives us the overview of all of our settings for this project. So we have issue types. So you can see these are the issue types that are currently in our project. If you remember when we created our project, it started with just a task and a subtask. We currently do not have any versions, so you can see there's no unarchived versions. There's no versions here. We could add a version directly from here. We did look at versions in a previous video. Our workflow, so we'll look at workflows here coming up in a little bit, but we can see what scheme our workflow is using and what our workflow is right here. We can change that if we wanted to jump right into it. A lot of these are just kind of quick links to take you to places where you can actually change them. You also have components. So we haven't really looked at components. Components are essentially different parts. So think of this in like in a development world. It's just like the component would be, well, as it says right here, you have your database, your user interface, things like that you can break down. And then you can work with that very similar to the way that you have versions, where you can organize things and see what are all the issues, the features, the bugs, whatever that might be related to just your user interface, right? So you could add a component in order to do that. You have your screens. So screens are showing you what fields you see on an issue. So when you come up here and hit create issue and it asks you what are all these different options, right? So the summary, the due date, all this is a screen that you're seeing. And if, so for example, if you did not want to see due date, you would change that on the screen. All right, so that's essentially what a screen is. We have our roles. So what are the user permissions on this particular project, and what are their roles? So you can create the actual roles. So if you wanted somebody to be maybe an administrator, you wanted somebody to be maybe a team leader, and that would give them permission to close issues. But then for the regular members, you did not want them to be able to close or delete an issue or things like that. You could set that up. And then you actually have permissions for the entire project. All right, so these work hand in hand with roles very, very closely, and we will look at that, how we can work with these later on in this module. We have our fields. So you have the screen that shows what fields you can display, and then the fields themselves, so you can actually come in and choose what fields are associated or what are required or optional. So, for example, maybe in this project, we want to make the due date a required field. But in our other project, we don't want due date to be a required field. You can set that up here with our field configuration. We have our notifications. So by default, do you want somebody to be emailed when something is assigned to them? Do you want somebody to be emailed if there's maybe an update to a ticket that they have watched? All of this can be managed here in the notification scheme. We have our general settings, so things like our mobile connect and things like that. That's has to do with essentially integrating this project into their. It's almost like a little API for iOS devices. That's what this mobile connect is. You can connect that in if you wanted to hook that in, maybe have users be able to create things on directly into Jira. You have your project mappings. So for example, if you were connecting this into a third-party system, maybe something like Zendesk or something like that, those third-party or remote systems, as Jira often calls them, those will have their own fields and their own configurations. So in order to work in Jira, you need to map that. So what is maybe a title in Zendesk is called a summary in Jira. You need to map those two things together. And there are some defaults that when you set up project mappings, and we won't really cover that too much in this particular course, but when you set those up, there are some defaults that will work, and then like a title to a summary, things like that are fairly straightforward. But depending on what the fields are, maybe they don't line up so well, and you need to kind of play around with those some. But you can configure that all here. And then you have your development tools. So, for example, if you're working with like GitHub or things like that, if you're integrating those directly into Jira, then you can control what sort of permissions people have for that or for that tool. Right? So whether or not they have the ability to create a branch directly inside of Jira, and then because that requires permissions in whatever the third-party tool is that you're using. All right, so that is a quick overview of this page. Now, over here on the left-hand side, we have our menus. So a lot of this stuff is very similar. So issue types, very similar. Workflows, you can see workflows here. A lot of these are very similar, and we'll be going through a lot of this throughout this module here. So we'll get familiar with what all of these are. But finally, I wanted to show up here on the top right-hand side, we have the ability to actually delete the project. So if for whatever reason you do want to delete a project, you can do that. However, when you do that, there's no takebacks. You can't get that information back. It's gone for good. So an alternative could be to simply lock everybody else out of the project, and that would archive it essentially. And one way that you can do that is with permissions. So you could create a permission scheme where nobody but you has access to it, in which case nobody would be able to even see it or see that it existed. But if for whatever reason you needed that information back, you could get it. So I speak from experience when I say that, because there's times where we don't really need that project anymore. That's for we created a project specific to maybe a mobile app that we didn't have around anymore. We just wanted to clear everything out, right? Well, rather than actually deleting it, I would archive it, because there were times here and there where I would have to go back to one of those issues where somebody had a comment on something and said something that we're trying to figure out, and what did we do in that other project or something like that. Well, if you kind of hide it from everybody else, you can go back and get that. So, all right. But anyway, that's kind of the overview of this project administration scheme, or project administration page, rather. So let's move on to our next video, where we'll take a look at issue types. In this video, we're going to learn how to create a new issue type. So what do I mean by an issue type? Well, essentially an issue type is really a way of organizing the different issues. All right, so we can filter based on issue type. We can really do a lot of things based on the issue type, and it's really just a way of organizing the different issues that you might have in a project. So think of it kind of like if you have Post-it notes, all right? So if you have yellow Post-it notes or blue Post-it notes or green Post-it notes, each of those colors would be a different issue type. It's just a way of organizing. Whereas, you're going to be putting the same sort of information on each one, right? You can write on a Post-it note. There's not something you can do with a green Post-it note that you somehow can't do with a orange Post-it note. It really just has to do with the color. The same is true for issue types. You can do anything with a standard issue type that you can do with any other standard issue type. It's just a matter of organization. All right. So, for example, right here on our dashboard, we can see this is an epic. This is a feature request. So these are two different types of issues. Now, if I go to create, we can see our project. We can see this one has a task, an epic, a story, a feature request. What if we wanted to actually add in a new custom issue type to this? Maybe something like a customer question. So that could be an issue type if it comes from customer support, something like that. Well, the first step of that would be to create a custom issue. So I'm going to cancel out of this. Let's come into the gear up here, go to issues. And the first thing we'll want to do is to add a new issue type. So you can see all of the different issues that are in our Jira instance. Now, it's important to understand that there's no difference between the issue types that are in different projects. So if you see a task in the demo project, it's going to be the same as a task in a different project. The issue type itself is not different. What's different is what screens or what fields you display in the different projects. The issue type itself is exactly the same. Now, that's very beneficial because you can actually apply these to different projects in different ways. So the first thing we'll need to do is to create an issue type. So I'm going to come up here to add issue type. Let's call this customer questions. There we go. We can give a description if we want. That's this little text right here that you can kind of see in the background. And then the type of issue is either standard or subtask. So the difference here is a standard issue is a root issue. So that's something that you will create inside of a project. A subtask has to be assigned to another issue. So for example, I'm going to cancel this real quick. So for example, this task is an issue type. This subtask has to be underneath a task. You can't have a subtask that is the root issue. So basically, that's the way that works. And you can call it whatever you want, but those are the two types of issues that you have in Jira. A standard or a subtask. So I want this to be a root, so it's going to be a standard issue type. Hit add. And there we go. We have our new issue type that's been created. Now, if we wanted to change the little icon, we could do that. We can hit edit. We can select a new image. We can upload a custom image. If you want to create a custom image, you can do that. Maybe let's use this little question mark because that'll work really well for the customer questions. That's great. Maybe this could be any sort of coming from customers. Little description, we can update that, and that's what we've added in there. So we've added in this custom issue type. All right, so the next step to this would be to apply it to a project. So we'll take a look at how we can do that in our next video. In our last video, we created a new issue type called customer questions. In this video, we're going to apply that to our demo project. All right, so what we need to do is we need to apply this particular issue type to a project. We're going to do that through an issue type scheme, and that's this right here. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, we have issue type schemes, workflows, workflow schemes, screen schemes. You kind of see a little trend here going on. That's basically how Jira works. You're going to create whatever the object is, and then you're going to use a scheme to apply it to something. So for example, we create the issue type, and then we use a scheme in order to apply it to a project. Same sort of thing. You create a screen, and then you use a scheme in order to apply it to a particular issue or a particular location. So like if you create or as opposed to edit, you can change what the screens are in those particular instances. We'll look at these later on, and we'll start to get an idea of the relationship between those. But just kind of want to get you familiar with this process of creating something and then using a scheme in order to apply it. So let's come into our issue type schemes. And what we'll need to do in this case, because we already have a demo project created and Jira automatically created a default scheme, what we'll want to do is to edit the scheme that already exists. So right now, this is the demo scheme. You can see it's applied to the demo project. So I'm going to come in and edit this scheme. What that's going to allow us to do is to choose which issue types are associated with that scheme. Okay, so we're just going to come in, take this customer questions. Let's drop this into the issue types here, hit save. And now if I come in and create a new issue under demo, now I can add a customer question as an issue type. Very, very cool stuff. And as you can see, it's a very powerful way of coming in and actually creating this issue. Now, if I create this and hit next, we have a lot of different fields that are in here. But let's say, I don't really need an estimate. I don't really need labels. I don't really need this due date for a customer question. Those might be great on something like a bug or something like that, but just for a little question, I don't really need these things. Well, we can take those off using screens. So that's what we'll look at in our next video, is how to actually come in and create a screen that we can then apply to that issue. In this video, we're going to learn how we can create a screen and then apply it to an issue type. All right, so this process may seem a little abstract the first time you run through it, and it took me a little while to kind of figure out what was going on. But I'd really encourage you, if you don't understand this kind of the first time through, watch it again, go through it on your own, and just keep repeating the process of adding screens to issue types until you get it. Trust me, it'll make sense. Once it kind of clicks, it's like, oh yeah, well, obviously that makes sense. That's a perfect way of being able to do that. But before the first few times you kind of go through it, it seems a little abstract and a little clunky. All right, so let's come in. The first thing we need to do is to create a screen. Very similar to the first thing we did was create an issue type. So I'm going to come into screens. And if you're not sure how to get to this page, it's up here under issues. All right, so we need to create a screen. So I'm going to add a screen, and this will be my customer questions screen so I know it's associated with that issue type. Now we need to tell Jira what fields do we want. All right, so I'm going to come in. I'm going to open up a new tab here. Hit create and see, okay, what are the fields that I probably want on this? And we have a lot more than just this to pick from, but I'm going to start here. So we need a summary. The summary is what Jira uses for all of these gadgets, for filters, for your agile boards, things like that. So this is a required field. So I'm going to add in summary. Say we need our summary. The reporter, let's add in the reporter. Now this is added in by default by Jira. It's whoever creates the ticket, but it is a required field. And if you want people to be able to change that, you need to show that on a screen. I'm going to add in a description. Yeah, you know what? Let's add in an attachment just in case somebody needs to maybe add a screenshot or something like that. Assignee and priority, and then I'm going to leave the rest of these off. So assignee, priority, there we go. All right, so you know what? Let's actually come in. I'm going to take the attachment, and I think it was, yeah, the attachment was above the description. So just kind of as a side note, this is something I've found in my experience. Your end users will come to expect a certain order for some of these very common fields. So I've gotten bug reports before where somebody would say, I want to add an attachment, but there's no ability to add an attachment to customer questions. Well, yeah, there is. You know, it's just down below description, and you just can't see it until you scroll down. So if people expect attachment between summary and description, usually I like to keep it very consistent across all of the different issue types. Otherwise, people kind of will not see something, and you'll have to go in there and fix it anyway if you're the administrator. So I'm going to come in and take attachment, and let's drag it up above description, and it looks like, yeah, so it was below reporter, above description, and just to kind of keep things consistent across all of the different screens. All right, now if we wanted to, we could add a tab. We could do that and then essentially just add in new fields. I'm not going to do that, just going to keep this simple and just keep one tab for now. All right, so now that we have our screen created, the next step is to add a screen scheme. So just like we added our issue types to the project using the screen scheme, what we need to do is to tell Jira where to show this screen. So not necessarily what project. We haven't gotten there yet. But we need to tell Jira, is this a create screen? Is this an edit screen? So this is a create screen. If I come over here and I hit E, this is an edit screen. So we can customize this to be different than our create screen. So if I come in here to this epic, and let's create an epic, you can see, okay, so this create screen it's a little bit different. So the edit screen has components. The create screen does not. Just slight differences here, but we can customize these different screens. So what we need to do is to add a scheme that tells Jira, okay, where am I going to use this? Am I going to use it when you create an issue or when you edit an issue, or maybe both? I'm going to do both, actually, in this case. So I'm going to hit Add Screen Scheme, and this is going to be my Customer Questions Screen Scheme. The default screen is going to be my Customer Questions screen that I just created. Hit Add. All right, so here's where we associate the operation. So by operation, what I mean is if you're creating an issue or editing an issue, we can associate a different operation. So if you create, edit, or view, and this right here, if I cancel out of this is the view page. All right, so those are the three primary operations. We can choose what we see on that screen. So what I'm going to do, because I want to do all of them, is I'm going to cancel out of this and let it be at the default. So I'd highly recommend, unless you have a specific reason to show something different on the create screen than the edit screen than on the view screen, I'd highly recommend keeping the default, which is going to be for all of the unmapped operations. Essentially what that means is if I tell it that I want to use this project management screen on create, okay? So when I create an issue, it's going to use this screen. But when I edit an issue, it's going to use this one. When I view an issue, it's going to use this one because we have not mapped edit or view. So all of the unmapped operations are going to show this default. So what I mean by my recommendation is, unless you want to actually show a different screen for each of those, I would highly recommend letting Jira work with the default for unmapped operations. The reason for that is because it can get to be very, very complex very quickly. So imagine if an end user thinks that it's a little bit disheartening to see the attachment way down here below description all the way at the bottom. Imagine what they would feel if they go in to create an issue and they type something out and they say, oh, the due date is, the due date is today, and then go in and edit the issue and all of a sudden the due date field isn't even there, or it's in a completely different location. It just causes some disorientation, and from my experience, I found usually what that results in is somebody contacting you, sending you an email, sending you a ticket on Jira and saying, there's a bug and I can't edit a due date once I add it in there. And so you have to go in there and fix it. So you can save yourself a lot of headache by just leaving things and not adding it in if you don't need to. All right, so moving along here, we've added in our screen scheme. Now what we need to do is we need to associate this screen scheme with the issue type. So right now, Jira doesn't know where to use this scheme. So that's where this issue type screen schemes comes into place. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in and we're going to say, okay, I'm going to use this screen scheme because it's applied to this particular project. Now, if we needed to, we could create a new one, but because we already have one that's associated with this project, I can use this guy. So I'm going to configure, and if you remember, very similar to our screen schemes, this is for all unmapped issue types. So essentially, what's going on here? I'm going to open up this in a new tab to see. Okay, so this issue type screen scheme is saying for all issue types in the project that I'm associated with, which currently, if you remember, is the demo project, you can see right here. For all of these, for all of the issue types in this project, use this screen scheme. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to use it for all of the issue types in that project except for the one that I just created. Because if you remember on our screen scheme, we created a new screen scheme right here. So I don't want to use this one. So I want to use my custom screen scheme. Okay, so I'm going to come in and hit associate. I'm going to associate with the customer questions issue type and I'm going to associate the customer questions screen scheme. As soon as I hit add, what this means is very similar to what we saw before for the create, edit, and view screens, except this is for issue types. So for the customer questions issue type in the demo project, it will use this screen scheme. This screen scheme is then saying, okay, for if you create an issue, if you edit an issue, or if you view an issue, we're going to use the customer questions screen that we created. Does that kind of make sense how that hierarchy works? Once you start to kind of jump in here and play with it, it will start to make a lot more sense as you actually do your own customizations and add in there. There's really only so much that can do kind of showing how it works, but what I found is just diving in and starting to play with it on your own. What I've actually done before in my experience was create a new project, call it test project, whatever you want, and then just start playing around with all this stuff. And then just delete everything that you are that you don't want once you actually start to go live for your end users. But as you start to play around with this, just feel free to break things, right? Because if you're working within a test environment in a test project, it's not really going to affect anything else. All right, so that's kind of how this setup works. So now if I come in and I create a customer question, you can see the fields on this create are my summary, reporter, attachment, description, the assignee, priority. I can actually edit this, so I can come into my screens. And let's say I wanted to add in, let's find something. Let's say, yeah, you know what? Let's add in a due date. So we wanted to add in a due date. Now if I come in, I need to switch issues and then switch back just to refresh. I don't need to refresh the whole page. You can see the due date is added down here. I can rearrange this if I want to, so I can move the due date up. Once again, I would have to refresh this single page. So you can see the due date has been moved up. So that's how we can add a screen, use a screen scheme to then tell it what operation to apply it to, and then use the issue type screen schemes to tell it what project to assign or what issue types to assign that to. Now, the last thing I want to point out is how would you take this issue type screen scheme and assign it to this project? Well, that's actually done in the projects view. So in the administration of a project, we can come in and we can tell it what screen scheme we're using. So we can change that. If we click on this, we can tell it to use a different scheme. We can create a new scheme if we wanted to, and then that's where that trickle down starts to happen. All right, so I know we covered a ton of content, and a lot of it may seem to be very abstract. What I'd really recommend moving forward is if this does not make sense, try it again. So go through the process, watch this video again, try it on your own. Rather than just watching this, open up Jira and create a screen. Okay, once you have a screen created, create a screen scheme. Once you have a screen scheme created, create an issue type scheme or apply it to an issue type scheme that is already existing. You can go in and look at the default issue type screen schemes and the screen schemes and the screens themselves and see how they all fit together. It takes a little bit to kind of get familiar with how all of this works, but once you start to understand the relationship between the issue type, the screen scheme, the issue types scheme, even the issue types themselves, the issue type schemes, all of those things, how they start to play together, you'll really start to understand the power behind Jira and behind the administrative side of Jira and how you can start to bring all of this together to organize your Jira instance. All right, now the last thing I want to point out is if you do go in through the process of trying things out and you start to create a bunch of things that you don't need, you might need to actually delete some of them. But you cannot delete an issue type screen scheme if it's associated with a project. So what you would need to do is to associate that with, or go into the project where we just were, associate it with a new issue type screen, and then delete the old one. So if we add in, I'm just going to add in a test one here, you can see if there's nothing associated with it, then we can come in and delete this. So if you don't see that it has a delete right here, that means it's associated with the project, so you need to disassociate that by essentially taking that project and associating it with a new one, and then you can delete that and clear that out. Once you have that cleared out, you can create a new one, play around with it, and start to understand all of this together. All right, so we've learned a lot in this lesson. Let's move on to our next lesson, where we'll learn about something a little more concrete, and that's statuses. In this video, we'll learn about statuses. All right, so what do I mean by statuses? Just to kind of show this real quickly, let's come into an example. So the ticket here. So you can see the status right here. So this status is currently to do. Now, in this particular workflow, there are 3 statuses. There's to do, in progress. So if I click start progress, it'll change to in progress. And then if I click done, it will go to done. So you can see the workflow for this particular project right here. So each of these are a status. Now, the way that this essentially works inside of Jira is you have your statuses, and then you have the transitions between statuses. So this is the transition right here to go from one status to another. Now, in order to create these and manage these, you're going to do that inside of a workflow. But before we get to workflows, the first thing is to create these individual statuses. Very similar to when we were creating an issue type. Before we created the scheme and associated it with a project, we had to create the actual issue type first. Just like that, we actually have to create the status before we can create the connection or the association with the project. So let's come into our settings here for administration, come into issues, and then on the left-hand side, down towards the bottom, we will see issue attributes, and let's click on statuses. All right, so just like pretty much everything else inside of Jira, these statuses are independent of the project. So what I mean by that is this particular status right here, we can have this in as many projects as we want. We don't have to create a new to-do status for each individual product, or project rather. All right, so in order to create a new status, we just need to come up here to add status. Click on that. Let's give this status a name. So let's say maybe pending approval. We can give it a description, which is this text down here, just kind of the descriptive text, very similar to what we've seen so far. And then there's the category. So if you remember in a previous video where we were talking about the agile boards, there are 3 categories for a status. And we saw this when we saw the columns for our agile board. There's the to-do category, there's in progress, and there's done. You cannot add or create these categories as of recording this video. And I've used Jira for years, and you've never been able to add these. However, what you can do is you create the status inside of the category. So you'll have a category, for example, this one, pending approval. Chances are pending approval status means that something has been started, but it isn't done yet, which essentially means that it's in progress. So the category would be in progress. So just use what makes sense. So I've had statuses, mostly to do is generally just kind of to do, and that's pretty much it. I've had statuses in done that are maybe canceled, or maybe something like just not going to do, won't complete. Maybe if it's a feature that we wanted to do at one point, but maybe not going to do. At that point, you can add that there. So most of the statuses that I've added in my experience have been in progress, but periodically you'll add one, usually something like canceled or on hold or something like that. All right, so I'm going to add this into in progress. Once we add that, you can see it's in here. Here it is. Now we need to associate this with a workflow in order to get this to work. Now, workflows are they can be a very complex system that can be a little tough to understand. So let's move on to our next video where we'll get an overview of workflows before we start diving into editing them. In our previous video, we learned how to create a status. Now let's take a look at just kind of a general overview of what workflows are so we can see how this all fits together. So I'm going to come over to the left-hand side and click on Workflows. And then I'm going to start with this first one here. Let's do the Demo Project Management Workflow. This is just one of the default workflows that got created when we created our demo project here in Jira. So I'm going to click on View. And that's going to allow us to view this workflow. So in this little view here, we can navigate around. We can left click and drag to pan around. We can zoom out. We can zoom in or to see things a little bit easier. We can even click on this little arrows to go to full screen mode so we can hide everything else. All right, so what are we seeing here? Essentially, this is the pathway that your issues will move through your system. So when an issue is first created, it will first go into the to-do status. From there, you can take that and you can move it to in progress. From there, you can take it and drag it to done. Now you notice these arrows are going both ways. So what that means is I can take this and go to in progress. Once this is in progress, I can take it and either go to done or I can go back to to-do. Same with done. So I can either take this from back to in progress. I can take this back to to-do. You can see the arrows are going both ways. When I perform one of those operations, so if I were to take a ticket and take it from to-do to in progress, what that would do is that would run one of these transitions. So in this case, it would be the start progress transition that you can see when I hover over. Now, if I were to take this and go back to to-do, it would do the stop progress transition. And very similar to when I go from done back to in progress, you can see reopen and start progress. And then from in progress to done, it's the done transition. It's the same transition as if I go from to-do to done. So essentially, the way that a workflow works here in Jira is this is a visual mapping of how essentially the life of your issue. So I'm going to exit full screen mode real quick just so we can kind of see this in another view. All right, so if I come back into my board here, let's come into a sample board. So we can see everything is not started, right? So that is the status to do. If I take this and drag this to in progress, all of a sudden the status is in progress. If I take this to done, the status is done. So the issues and the status is directly applicable to this workflow right here. Now we're able to take it from to-do to in progress to done because of our workflow right here and because of the transitions that are allowed between those statuses. So if you remember in a previous video, we created a new custom status. All right, so let's look at how we can add this in. I'm going to come in and let's edit this workflow. So I'm going to go to edit, and that's going to create a new draft. So by default, you're never going to be editing a live workflow. That's very important to understand because if your end users are working right now and they're trying to drag something from to do to in progress, and you're currently editing that transition, you can really start to mess that up as you're making adjustments. So you're always going to be editing a draft workflow, and then you publish that draft to make it live. All right, so let's add in our status here. So I'm going to go to Add Status. This will be the pending approval status that we just created. Once we add this status, we have the ability to choose if we want every single status to be able to transition to this one. That's what this checkbox is right here. What do I mean by that? So essentially, if we were to come into our Agile board, and let's say, okay, so this is in the status not started. So it's currently to do, right? So if we want to be able to take this to in progress or done, we can do that. You can see I can transition between either status. And the same is true if I go to in progress, I can transition to either status. Essentially, that's what it's saying. It's saying, do you want to be able to go from to do to pending approval, from in progress to pending approval, from done to pending approval, and vice versa, from pending approval to do. You could set this up manually, which is the way that this looks right here. This is set up manually. Or you can have Jira automate this and save you a ton of time. Now, if you're not sure what you should do right here when you're setting this up for the first time, I would highly recommend allowing all status transitions to go into each status. That way, when your end users are trying to drag things between different boards, if they're not able to drag something, that is because you haven't set up a transition between those two statuses. So if you run into that issue, and trust me, I've run into this issue many, many times as I was learning Jira, you'll need to fix that by adding a transition between those statuses. And so that's where this comes in handy, is you can avoid those types of issues. So I'm going to come in and click Add. Now, when I add this status, so you can see this here, and all transitions are going into this particular status. Now, if I publish this, there's going to be something interesting that happens. So, no, I'm not going to save a backup. I'm going to publish this. It's going to go live instantly. And now I need to come in and configure my board. Let's add in a new lane here for pending approval. There we go. Take the status that we just added, drag that in there, and go back to the board. All right, so now if I take this, I can drag this to pending approval. But once it's in pending approval, you'll notice I can't take it to any other status. Why is that? Even though in our workflow, we told it to transition between all different statuses. Well, that particular issue has to do with these default transitions that have been created for us by Jira. So let's move on to our next video, where we'll take a look at how we can fix this issue and dive a little bit deeper into working within workflows. In this video, we'll pick up right from where we left off in our previous video and dive a little bit deeper into editing workflows. All right, so if you remember, we had created a new status. We added the status to our workflow, and it's not working the way that we would expect. So we told it to be able to transition between all statuses. But when we come in here and we drag something to pending approval, we can't drag it out of that particular status. Now, the reason for this has to do with these transitions that have been created for us. And essentially, since these statuses are allowing us to go between all of the other statuses anyway, a really quick fix for this would be to come in and tell each of these statuses to transition between all other statuses as well. So let's come in and edit this workflow. Edit the workflow, select this guy here, tell all statuses to transition, and then we'll want to come in and delete the existing transitions. There we go. Delete those. essentially I'm just clicking on this arrow here and deleting each of these transitions. And what that's going to leave us is the statuses by themselves. So now I need to select the status, tell it to transition between all other statuses. Same for this. You'll notice the little red dotted line. That means that that is an orphan status. So there's no way to get a card to this particular status because there's no transitions. So we either need to transition manually by clicking and dragging, or we need to come in and tell it to allow all statuses to transition. There we go. All right, so with that done, let's publish this. No, I don't need to save a backup. Let's publish, try this out, and now we can move this between any of the statuses. So we can take this into pending approval, and we can take it back to in progress. We can take this from really anywhere that we want, any of these particular issues. All right, so if you notice, this guy here is actually crossed out, as is this one. So when I bring this over to done, it's actually going to cross these out, and that's due to something called resolutions. So let's move on to our next video where we'll take a look at resolutions. In this video, we will learn about resolutions. All right, so here on this board, you can see that this card here and this card here are both crossed out. Now, that has to do with the resolution. So the resolution is sort of like the status, but it kind of adds a little bit more context to the status. So let's say we have the ability to upload attachments, and we don't really want to do this. It's not something that it's not a feature we want to implement. It's a good idea, but we're just not going to do it. So you could drag it to done and then tell the resolution to be something like, we're not going to do this. Okay, so in order to do this, or in order to see this, let's come into the issues here, the issues administration side, come into resolutions, because this will make a little bit more sense. So these are the default resolutions that have been added by Jira. We can add in new resolutions if we want to. So in my experience, one of the most popular resolutions that we had was this. Just probably not going to do it. Something like that, right? So add that in. We can, and then apply these to the issues through a screen, because all this is essentially is just a field. So if we wanted to, let's come in, and you'll notice when I come into the board here and I take something to done, it doesn't actually pop up a screen letting me choose the resolution. So let's come into our workflow here and edit this workflow. And under done in the transition here, let's come into properties. Oops, I'm sorry. Let's go back. I need to go into the post functions rather, not properties. And I want to use, so right here it says the screen is none. I want to use the resolution screen, this guy here. There we go. So that will be this screen. Let me publish this. All right, so now that we've updated that, let's come in back to our board here. Oh, I need to publish this as well. And, I think I already published that. Yeah, I already published this. I just published it in a different tab. That's why it was giving me that error. All right, so let's say I'm going to bring this back to not started. Let's say, okay, this is done now, and now it will pop up a screen where I can choose the resolution. So I can say, this is done, but we're not really going to do it. Or, probably not. Or whatever the resolution is that we want. And this is just another way of organizing the issues because, or especially, this can be helpful with bugs. So in my experience, I found a lot of times bugs will be submitted, whether internally or externally. They can either be maybe 5 people will submit the same bug? Well, they're all different issues, but you don't really need your dev team or your engineering team focusing on 5 different issues. Instead, you can close 4 of them as a duplicate, and that's the resolution. And then the other one you can keep open. Or if you go through testing and it's not really something that's something you can replicate, you can say cannot reproduce. You can create your own resolutions that I did with this one here, or you can really customize this however you want. The benefit to this is, once again, it's just organization, right? So you can filter, you can find any issues based on this resolution. So if I were to say, this is a duplicate, or maybe this one here, this is something we're just not going to do. Now I can come in, do a search for issues, and I can find, if I come under more here, look for the resolution. The resolution is maybe duplicates. Here's that issue. So we can start to find how many duplicate issues we have reported, or how many maybe feature requests we have that we've just decided we're not going to do. Whatever those resolutions are, whatever that is, we can really start to organize all of these issues that much further. All right, so we've looked at customizing Jira quite a few different ways, but we haven't really looked at how we can actually create some custom fields. So let's move on to our next video where we'll take a look at that. In this video, we'll take a look at how we can create custom fields. All right, so let's come in under our administration, come under issues, and over on the left-hand side, we have the ability to create our custom fields. So if you remember when we were adjusting our screens, really all of these are default fields that are added in. You probably saw a lot of these before. So things like our status, or things like the epic link, or things like that we've already added, or have already been added for us rather by Jira. So let's come in and create a custom field. So let's say we want to do something around operating system. So let's say we have our dev project and people are submitting bugs, and we want to be able to give them a profile to submit the bugs for. So whether they're using Windows, Mac, or Linux. So let's come in. When you add a new field, we have these options for the field type. Now, if we want to be able to choose a single choice, this drop-down would probably work best. There we go. So the field will be operating system, and let's add these in. So Windows, Mac, Linux. We could get more specific if we wanted, versions, any of those if we wanted to. Just for the sake of this example, I'm just going to leave this at those 3. Hit create, and now we have our field created. Now there's a couple things that happen. First, we get this little pop-up. Essentially, what this means is Jira recognizes that we've added a new field. If you remember in a previous video where we were doing the bulk edits, we saw that every single field is actually applied to every single issue. So what that means is this field is being applied to every single issue. The only thing that's keeping it from being visible is whether or not we put it on a screen, right? So essentially what this little pop-up is saying is, hey, you added a new field, which means we need to reindex everything because we don't know if this field is going to be applied to an issue or not, or if there's going to be a value in this field, and we need to reindex in order to be able to make that happen. So we will do that here in a little bit, but let me actually click this to open up in a new window, and we will take a look at that here in a second. The first thing I want to do is to add this to a screen. So let's say we're going to add this to the customer questions screen. I'm going to select that, click update. All right, so we have added our custom field. It's visible on the customer question screen. If we come into our screens here and configure this, we can see by default it will get dumped into the bottom. So we can move this up if we wanted to. We can kind of arrange that however we want. But now if we come in and create a new issue, customer questions, if you scroll down, You can see the operating system. And now we have this field that we've added and we've created inside of Jira. So as you can imagine, really the sky's the limit on this. You can create as many fields as you want. You can add them to all your different screens. You can really start to customize this and really start to get dangerous. So I'd really recommend kind of taking a step back and thinking about what fields do you want? What projects do you want those in? What screens do you want those on? Start to build that out, and then you can actually come in and start to add this all into Jira and really customize everything. All right, so now that we have that added, I'm going to come in and index this. So I'm going to do a background re-indexing. I would always recommend doing background. If you really need it to happen really quickly, for some reason, you can lock Jira and rebuild the index. Realistically, in my experience, years and years of using Jira, I've never had a need to lock Jira and rebuild the index. It will not take as long as the background reindex, but realistically, with tens and tens of thousands of issues, the longest I've ever had a reindex take is maybe about 5 minutes. So it really doesn't take that long in order to reindex. And realistically, I can click reindex, it's going to do it. I can come over here and start doing something else. I don't even really need to keep this open. So it's not like it's something you need to babysit. There's really no reason to actually lock people out of Jira in order to do your re-indexing. All right, so that is a look at creating custom fields. Let's move on to our next video where we will take a look at project permissions. In this video, we're going to get an overview of project permissions. Now, when it comes to project permissions, there's really no right or wrong way to do them. And by that, what I mean is there's no way that I can say, this is the right way to do project permissions. This is the only way, and there's no way that you should do it any other way. Your team or your company is going to have a very unique situation, and so how you set up project permissions is going to be unique to you. So I can't really give you a step-by-step guide. Instead, what I can do is something very similar to what I've done throughout this course, and that's just kind of give you the tools that you need to start understanding the permissions and how they work inside of Jira, and then hopefully that will be enough to send you off to where you're willing and you're able to actually take that on and start to build it out and customize it for your own team. All right, so let's take a look at how we can adjust this. So I'm going to come into projects, come into the demo project. We can start with that one. And we've gone in here before. I'm going to go into the project settings. If we scroll down, we have users and roles and permissions. Let's start with permissions. All right, so essentially, these are the default permissions that have been set up. So as we can see, okay, so anybody that is in the project role of administrators can administrate this project, which means they can come in and make all of these settings. So if we wanted to adjust this, we can come into users and roles. I'm going to open this in a new tab. And all we would need to do is to add a new user under administrators. So I would come into add new users to role. I could add in one of the other users that I've created, maybe this guy here, administrators, add, there we go. So now we have a new administrator, and when this person logs in, they will be able to get to this administration screen because the project has this permission set up. Very similar for everything else. And I'm not going to go through each of these. They're pretty straightforward. If you browse through them, you'll be able to read. And this description is very good to kind of explain what it does. But what you can do is you can come in and you can customize this for your team. So I'm going to come in and let's edit these permissions. And let's say, for anybody to be able to browse this, let's say rather than that, let's say we want to anybody that has access to our Jira can browse this project. There we go. So instead of anybody who's logged in, anybody who we've given application access to, if you remember in a previous video where we're talking about our users and giving them application access, we can control the permissions for this project based on that. Now, if you remember also in a previous video, we set up some groups so we can actually control based on that as well. So let's say managing sprints. We want somebody in one of the groups we set up in the marketing group. So anybody in the marketing team, let's say we want them to be able to manage sprints for this project. There we go. We've set that up. So as you can see, editing the permissions themselves is fairly straightforward. Really, the key behind this is setting up things like groups. So we talked about groups before, but how are you going to organize those for your team? Maybe not actually based on teams, right? So maybe you could do groups based on your teams, but maybe you want a group of sprint administrators. Now, in my experience, I've found that usually team leaders are the ones that are going to be managing sprints. So we would create a group that would be team leaders and then allow anybody who is a team leader the ability to manage sprints in this project, and so on and so forth, for a lot of these different permissions. And as you can see, there's a lot of them in here, and really you can dial down and really start to gain a lot of control over who can do what and what they can do in this particular project. And the same is true for any project that you're working with here inside of Jira.